Greetings, blessed community, and Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to you. My name is Dave Miller. I'm Director of Sacred Breeze Ministries. When the website is working, Sacred Breeze Ministries can be found at sacredbreeze.org or on Facebook. Just a note, I have a trach, as you can see, a tracheotomy. And if you hear breathing being picked up by the mic, it's not really something I can control, so please be tolerant. I'm sharing a short message today that's not strictly traditional in the Christian sense, but it is based on the history of the times in which Jesus of Nazareth was born. The message doesn't go into the miraculous occurrences like the virgin birth recorded in Christian scripture, but I do believe it's in keeping with the spirit of Christmas, the spirit of hope, peace, and love. Since it's based on history as reported by Roman historians of the time and others, I think this message can be well received by people of any faith, including Christians as well as people of no faith. I will warn you that the history of the times in which Jesus was born were somewhat brutal. The brutality will be mentioned, but not portrayed graphically in any way. Anyway, have a little faith and allow me to guide you for the next 20 minutes or so. The Christian holiday known as Christmas is centered on a person named Jesus, who is believed to have lived over 2,000 years ago in what is now modern-day Israel. Jesus was a common name back then, based on the name Joshua, who was a Jewish prophet who lived over 1,200 years before Jesus was born. Now, a lot has been written about the historical reality of the person Jesus. Some scholars deny his existence, but I think most acknowledge the likelihood that he did exist, even if they doubt the miraculous occurrences surrounding his life. Christmas, of course, acknowledges the birth of the person known as Jesus of Nazareth, and in so doing, also acknowledges the existence of his mother, who was named Mary. Historians would probably agree that if Jesus existed, his mother existed also. On a side note, for those who are aware of Judeo-Christian and Islamic traditions regarding the creation of humanity, isn't it interesting how those narratives insist that women are somehow derived or come from men? I was just reading from the Hindu Upanishads, and I saw a similar narrative saying that women were sourced from men as well. In a way, Christmas affirms the fact that men, even men who are described as having divine attributes, are born from women. But anyway, back to the main story. The biblical narrative of Jesus' birth includes several events that were also independently recorded by Roman historians during that period. These other historical events included the reign of Augustus Caesar in Rome, the death of Herod the Great, and a census imposed on the Judean region by the Roman governor Quirinius. While Christian scripture describes the census as happening first, followed by the death of Herod, Roman historians say that Herod was born 4 years before the beginning of the Common Era, and the census occurred 6 years after the beginning of the Common Era. This puts a 10-year question mark on the historical date and circumstances surrounding the birth of Jesus. Another event that has been reported by Roman historians was a revolt in Galilee, which is where Jesus was raised, led by a man named Judas of Galilee. And that revolt was started in protest to that census. The revolt is also mentioned, by the way, in the Christian scripture in the Gospel of Luke, no, not in the Gospel, by Luke, the author Luke, in the Christian Bible in Acts 5:37. After overcoming the revolt with overwhelming force, the occupying Roman forces crucified some 2,000 people who participated in the revolt. A revolt that was put down so violently, followed by a mass crucifixion killing thousands of people, would have been big news in a small region like Galilee. Based on town sizes and population distributions of the time, some estimates place the population of the region well under 200,000 people. The deaths of perhaps 2% of the entire population during the war and the crucifixion, or perhaps 4% of the males in the population, would have been felt heavily by the region. And the deaths would have been heavily felt by the families that lost brothers, husbands, and fathers. And Jesus may have been as old as 10 years old. He may have been 10 years old during the revolt, which may explain why it was not recorded in the birth narrative. A mystery that's often discussed based on the birth narrative. Another mystery, is what happened to Joseph. Joseph was described as the husband of Jesus' mother Mary. After the birth narrative, he seems to disappear. Now, some have speculated that Joseph lost his life during the rebellion, either to the battle or the mass crucifixion that followed. Given the size of the region, which is about the same size as San Jose, California, and the population, it's definitely possible that the husband of Jesus' mother participated in and died as a part of that rebellion. It's also possible that Jesus' friends from the region may have lost their fathers to the rebellion in the same mass crucifixion as well. Yeah, Christian scripture says his friends James and John were also known as the sons of thunder. Maybe thunder was a covert name their father had while participating in the rebellion. What do towns and regions and people and families do with that kind of trauma, that kind of loss? For some, including the children of Judas of Galilee and others, the traumatic memory inspires and provokes more rebellion and more violence. The Roman historian Josephus, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, said in Antiquities 20, chapter 5, that about 40 years later, Judas's sons, James and Simon, were captured and crucified for continuing the violence and rebellion. And some 70 years after that, after the birth of Jesus, 70 years after the birth of Jesus, the Romans completely destroyed Jerusalem and killed all her inhabitants. Now, while some use the trauma to fuel ongoing violence, what about a young mother and child who may have suffered such tragic loss? A mother's instinct would be to love and protect the child from such trauma recurring. Remember the reaction that mothers in particular had to the Vietnam War. I remember it, you may not. Moms who lost children and husbands recognized the futility of war and stood up for peace and an ending to hostilities. It may well be that Jesus' mother also recognized the futility of violence and conflict and decided that love would be a better and safer course for the life of her young child. It is possible that Jesus' mother taught him that love is the right path to follow rather than violence. Now, growing up, Jesus' education would have included stories from his history, the history of his people, stories of empires rising up and conquering each other. The empires included the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Macedonians under Alexander the Great, and finally the Romans. The history he learned would also have included his own people portrayed as conquerors, taking the land from the resident Canaanites of the region thousands of years before. He would have also learned that every conquest resulted in death, misery, slavery, and displacement. By the time the Romans came around, the history of conquest and suffering was ingrained in the minds and hearts of the Jewish people. Now, while many of the conquering cultures had disappeared by the time Jesus was around, Jesus' own Jewish culture and heritage and faith remained steadfast through all of that, through all of the suffering and death and displacement. He would have learned that the loving kindness that the God of the Jewish people had for them and the love that they each had for each other held them together through the worst of traumatic times. He would have also learned that the earliest stories from his tradition said that his own Jewish heritage was meant to be a blessing to all nations, inspiring peace and love among all people. While the urgings and teachings of his mother, and the lessons of his education and faith, it is possible that Jesus was raised to recognize both the futility of violence and the power of love. It is possible that the teachings shared during his life regarding love of neighbors, love of strangers, and even love of enemies alike were inspired by the events of his birth and the love and the teachings of his mother and his history and heritage. Historically, great messengers don't just rise up out of nowhere and nothing. Great messengers become great because they give voice to a sentiment that many people carry in their hearts. Expressed theologically, God inspires great messengers to give voice to the suffering of the people. The time in which Jesus lived wasn't the only time when people were faced with mass killings, oppression, and violence. I mentioned the mothers during the Vietnam War era who rose up and said enough, not only to war but also to the oppression of women and LGBTQ people. Consider also the voice of Martin Luther King Jr., whose voice said enough not only to war, but also to the oppression and violence against people of color. Just as Gandhi's voice in India and Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela's voices in South Africa said enough as well. And just as the Dalai Lama's voice continues to say enough, as the people and culture of Tibet suffer under decades of oppression and exile, all these voices say enough is enough. And rather than meeting violence and hatred with more of the same, choose the path of love. Prophetic voices do not rise up in isolation. They give voice to the suffering of thousands and millions. They represent the voices of mothers and parents and people of all ages and races and cultures and sexual orientations as well. Many of us often feel those experiences, similar feelings today as well, in response to mass shootings, in response to never-ending wars, in response to justice systems that do not treat all citizens equally, and in response to voices that lift up division and blame rather than peace and love. Enough is enough. Jesus gave voice to a similar sentiment in Galilee. Enough is enough. Let the voice of love be heard. Let peace reign. Let the love a mother has for her children represent the voice of God, rather than a voice of fear, anger, and violence. The stories of the miracles that surround Jesus' birth, life, death, and resurrection are often used to claim the divinity of Jesus and with that, claiming the truth and the power of Jesus' teachings. This Christmas message is not meant to dispute or argue any of these claims, narratives, stories, or miracles described in Jesus' life. This Christmas message simply suggests that the special revelation Jesus brings to the world with his birth, the message of hope and love and peace, also carries the strength of experience, of history, and the love of his mother, who nurtured, taught, and shared with him. This Christmas season, let us embrace faith from the perspective that Jesus was born with, lived with, and taught, and died for, the perspective of love. May the message of Christmas be preserved and always remain the same. May the lessons of experience, history, and love a mother holds for her children always be a guiding light. Peace on earth. Peace on earth. And goodwill towards all. Peace on earth. Peace on earth. And goodwill towards all. Have a Merry Christmas. Thank you.